I'm JJ Perez with Inside Runner Sports. That is Greg Luca with the San Antonio Express News. Greg, we are back from about a 1 month hiatus since we last
Yeah,
did one of these. Coming to you following the UTSA's big 38-24 win over Florida Atlantic. Greg, a much needed win for the Roadrunners after a pretty rough month. Uh, just, losing two winnable games and kind of playing as complete as we've seen them so far, don't you think?
yeah, I really thought the story of the game was UTSA's ability to overcome a lot of different things. You start with just kind of the weight of starting 2-4 and having never
Yeah.
been in a position before for this group, and then you add in all the different injuries that it might have felt like an exaggerated talking point early in the year, but now you're starting to see it's just more and more and more taking a toll on this team and becoming a really legitimate issue and probably the biggest thing that they're still grappling with as the season moves forward. And then just to have three turnovers in the game and some pretty back-breaking plays there. There was a near pick six and there was a fumble return for a touchdown. And to see UTSA not get rattled by those plays and not have that become something that snowballs on them, I thought all of that was really impressive in terms of a show of resiliency.
Yeah, I want to start with the defensive performance we saw because that unit has given up some big plays in recent weeks, and I mean, you wouldn't have expected Rice and East Carolina to play as well offensively as they did against that unit and against FAU, which I mean, you might think that offense is going to do something. The Roadrunners, almost pitch a second half shutout. I think defensively they didn't allow a point in the second half, give up 203 total offensive yards. More than half of that comes on two plays early in the game, right? So
Right.
to me, it was a front seven dominant performance, a ton of pressure from that group. And, that was a pretty good quarterback, a super athletic quarterback they went up against.
Yeah, I think if you took out FAU's four most productive plays, it was like 48 yards on 50 snaps or something like that, which, anytime you take away a team's best plays, those numbers look a little bit skewed, but that's pretty drastic. And you mentioned the second half where it was just 29 total yards and they ran for negative 19. So it was just a really impressive performance overall from UTSA's defense. I thought particularly the ability to create pressure up front. I think they had 7 sacks in this game, which matches the school record, and it was all from different guys. I don't think anybody had more than one. So they always talk about the depth and the talent that they have up there and the ability for a variety of different guys to be able to create pressure. And they did do some things blitz wise, but also it just felt like they were guys who were capable of winning their matchups. Like Jamoy Robinson, who didn't end up with the sack, I felt was getting after the quarterback pretty much every time he was on the field. So I thought it was a really impressive performance by that front seven, and it led to the defensive numbers that you saw.
Yeah, I thought they were also super aggressive with their play calling. A lot of these third down, they got off the field on third down, right? We saw corner blitzes, we saw them scheme it up a lot. 13 tackles for loss, seven, including 7 sacks. I mean, I didn't think this defense would be as good as we saw against FAU just based on what we've seen them inconsistent the previous month.
Yeah, well, I was going to say if you went from the preseason and then just fast forwarded to yesterday, that's probably what you would expect to see, right? That group was supposed to be the unit on this team that had shown a lot of promise late last season and then returned the bulk of their guys and seemed like if everybody took a step forward, they could be pretty dominant. And there were times where we saw that up to this point in the year through the first half of the season, and there were other times where those big plays really got them. And we saw yesterday where they gave up one or two of those chunk gains, including what was a 79-yard, 76-yard touchdown run for the quarterback, kind of on a scramble, like a broken play. And I guess some of that comes with aggression. I believe, if I remember right, that was a play where the nickel kind of was blitzing around the edge. And so once the quarterback steps up, that's one less guy he's got to worry about. And so you can see where if the other team calls the right numbers, that they're going to be able to punish that aggression sometimes. But UTSA really limited those types of breakdowns yesterday, and then we're pretty dominant on all the other snaps. So that adds up to what you saw. And I think, yeah, the team defensive wise had been trending that direction, but this is kind of just what we thought we'd be seeing all along.
Yeah, you mentioned it in the opening of this video about overcoming the three turnovers, two really bad interceptions that it just seemed like the secondary fooled quarterback Owen McCown and a trick backwards play gone awry that turns into 6 points for FAU. What was your take on the offense, Greg? 485 yards. I think this is 3 games consecutively with nearly 500 yards, but they put up the points this week. We haven't seen that in the previous 2 games, and I'm always the points are the most important stats, right? So, not too shabby of an offensive performance, I would say.
Yeah, as the game was unfolding, I felt myself kind of empathizing with the likely frustrations of the UTSA fan base because it felt like down to down the Roadrunners were outplaying FAU, but there were just these little things that were happening, particularly on offense, that were keeping Florida Atlantic in the game. And I thought Owen McCown played one of the worst games that we've seen from him this season in terms of his individual performance. Like if he played the way he played against Rice, I think this game would have been a blowout. But it just seemed like the ball was coming out of his hands kind of slow, and it led to those 2 interceptions that you saw. But it seems like they found something that they had tapped into it some this season, but really working the middle of the field for Owen and being able to hit some of these tight end routes up the seam and other opportunities to go over the middle. When you have a quarterback who's extremely accurate the way he is, but maybe doesn't have elite arm strength, it seems easier for those guys to work the middle of the field because you don't have to be able to push the ball all the way out wide, and you have the accuracy to fit it in a crowd of defenders that might be gathering in the middle of the field area. So I think that's maybe something they'll be able to tap into more, especially if we want to get into the receiver injuries and how much they might continue to rely on the tight ends the way they probably planned to, and maybe that group hasn't always lived up to expectations or delivered to this point in the season, but as the kind of healthy group standing, I think it's going to be a lot on them going forward. So, yeah, I do think there were some promising things they might have found with the offense beyond just those little mistakes. You know, the thing with the fumble return, you can make an argument about whether it was the right time to dial up some kind of a gadget play there, but I think if it works, nobody has any issues with it. It's just when something like that happens. And so, yeah, generally, I do think it was a pretty promising showing, and we'll see if Owen plays the way that he played against Rice, where he looked like, wow, this is where he was like the only one who was carrying his weight against Rice. It felt like if you get that level combined with what we saw from everybody else yesterday, then I think they could be in for some pretty good offensive production down the stretch.
Yeah, I think Owen was good enough, right? So obviously you can't have those 2 interceptions. What the first one, it didn't even look like he saw the safety, and the second one he stared down the guy and the safety just got to it. So
Yeah,
uh
but I mean, like even beyond that, there were some deep balls that were
yeah,
there. He hit, and he either overthrew him or under.
underthrew him.
Even the one that they converted, the one to
Yeah,
Overmeyer, he had to wait in the end zone for a while because the ball was underthrown relative to how open he was. So,
yeah,
that's a great example of, Owen did enough for them to be able to score
yeah.
that touchdown and win the game there. But I do think that there's a level that he's played at previously that if he gets back to that, then things will really be clicking on all cylinders.
Yeah, to your point though, I do think he started to click a little bit in the middle of the field, right? This is something we kind of both noticed in the game, and kind of the deep outside passes. Maybe he's not as accurate as, some of those seam routes, right? Look at how the tight ends have produced some of these, honestly game-changing plays down the stretch. And maybe that goes to what we saw at tight end, right? I think our and wide receiver. I believe there were only 5 tight ends on the field warming up, 4 when they first came out. We saw JT come out late, so obviously a slew of injuries at that position. And I mean, they ran out all 4 of those tight ends in various, situations. So I
You
don't
mean
know if
receivers, right?
you want to break down the wide receiver injuries and who's out. And I mean, I don't know if any of those guys are going to be back anytime soon, right?
Yeah, I mean, we can talk about DeCorian Clark first, just a heartbreaking
Yeah.
scenario for him too. It was his first catch since 22 when he had the really brutal knee injury to the right knee against UAB and the surgery that followed, and then the complications that kept him from ever getting back in last year, aside from a couple snaps, and then had to have a second surgery, and then was on track for recovery all through the summer and waiting and waiting and waiting through the preseason and the non-conference schedule to see when he'll get out there. And East Carolina game comes and he plays a few snaps and then he tweets, I'm cleared, like we're good to go essentially. And then against Rice, they don't see him. And Coach Traylor said that after the East Carolina game, there was a little bit of a setback and he had to be reevaluated. And so then I was surprised to even see him take the field against Florida Atlantic, even for warmups. That's why and maybe I just missed him, but it seemed like when the first group came out there, he wasn't on the field
He was
yet. And then
not on the field. No.
and then when they got into the actual like quarterback to receiver throwing part of the warm up process, we saw him in line there. So it was a little bit of a question of because we saw him warm up at times last season too, where he goes through that part of the drills, and then when the game comes, he's just standing on the sideline. And so I thought we were being for another one of those, and then they used him down in the red zone, which we've seen where they kind of like to ease him back in that capacity because he is such an effective, fade jump
Yeah.
ball catcher, and there's not as much kind of the cutting and lateral movement and the things that would stress your knee in those types of scenarios. And so then when he's in for a play in the middle of the field, that was a surprise to begin with, and then they hit him on the slant pattern, and it was kind of remarkable to think that that was the first pass he'd caught in probably 2 years plus. I forget what date his injury was, but and then immediately takes a hit and to the knee, and you could see when he got up how unstable it was, which is pretty alarming. I mean, I don't want to speculate, but that usually speaks to some kind of a tear. So you hope it's not something like that that's going to keep him out forever, and that maybe it was just a little whatever it would be that would cause him to look that way coming off the field because he was on the stationary bike and he was walking around and but you just never really know. So we'll see what the MRI reveals, but it was a pretty natural reaction for people watching to say, well, was it wrong for him to be back in there? But I think that's probably some confusion of the part where it
Right.
wasn't even the same knee that he'd been
We had to
rehabbing.
go back and check, right? Like
No,
visually look
but
at photos to see what knee was injured in which
because
game.
it's just so unbelievable that you would be so unlucky to have something horrible like that happen. And then the next time you catch a pass 2 years later, it's the other knee has
Yeah.
another gruesome injury. So, prayers to him for a speedy recovery, as everybody has been putting out there. I'm glad there's a lot of positive energy around that, but we'll
Not the
see.
only devastating injury at that position, right? DJ
Yeah,
DJ Allen, I mean, gosh, on the touchdown reception, right?
right, right. Just when it kind of felt like he might be finding his role and hitting his stride in this offense, and then that happens for him. And we saw Devin McEwen show up on the injury report. It wasn't super obvious where that would have occurred against Rice, but he ended up on the list this week. And so those are some of your top guys. And then you still have David Amador over there in shorts still. I don't know. We know why that has taken so long to get back. I know hamstring injuries can be particularly pesky, but this has
Yep,
been months
yep.
now, and you would think that he'd be getting closer and closer to a return. So you're left with a group kind of led by Chris Carpenter and Willie McCoy, who
Who's not
thankfully,
100% either, right? Willie McCoy was banged up.
yeah, thankfully for UTSA, Willie McCoy was able to get back in the mix. I know he had um, it was interesting to hear Coach Traylor say on the record that he had the concussion against ECU because, obviously I wasn't at that game. And then when I watched it back, I had already heard that he dropped a couple passes. And so then when the play happened in the first half where he looked really rattled by the hit that he took, I said, well, is that the reason that he's going to drop passes when I get to the second half? And then I don't know, maybe hopefully, that's a really serious deal if you're missing a concussion diagnosis because a second impact and the possibility that could have on a player's life and career. So I don't want to say that was, I don't want to say too much about that to get anybody in trouble there, but certainly if he was playing through something like that and then developed I think Trailer said in practice, it was a knee
A
issue
knee, yeah,
like on a cut, just kind of
yeah.
running around. And so that's probably part of both of those combined would be why he missed the game against Rice. And so to see him come back yesterday and have a little bit of impact, or at least be a body for somebody who can demand some attention and open some other things up in the passing offense, even if he's not 100% ready to make the big plays himself. So
Yeah.
we'll see. I mean, beyond those two guys, it's Jamel Hardy, steps forward. He had made a pretty impressive catch in a previous game this year. I forget which one that was, and then obviously delivered a pretty good grab on the fade pattern yesterday. So there's potentially some room for growth there, and we'll see what he brings to the table going forward too.
Yep. So a lot of tight end action, right? Like the tight ends were the slot receivers this game, basically, right? So that's been a position group that, quite frankly, hasn't played well this year. And I think there's a lot of room to improve. And I think they showed what they're capable of in this game. I don't know what the grades are for that group this week, but I would guess they're significantly better than in any of the previous weeks.
And on paper, it's an arrangement that makes sense because usually with a young quarterback, you think they want to lean on that security blanket, and with Owen's skill set, you would think they want to work on the middle of the field where those tight ends are consistently lined up. So maybe between both of those, the quarterback and the tight ends, kind of stepping forward and doing a little bit more, that could be a productive outlet for UTSA.
I guess let's just rip the band-aid off the rest of the injuries, right? The offensive line is the other group that seems kind of banged up. We're seeing guys I guess, battle through some injuries, right? Some guys that are out. We didn't see Venley. We saw a Ben Rios start in his place, another different starting offensive line combination. I think we fact checked this yesterday, 6 in 7 games.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, just a plug and play there as this season rolls on.
Yeah, I think it's Corey Godinet at right guard and Kamar Missouri at left tackle who have been just playing through injuries to this point in the year. And then CJ James has been pretty solid at center. And then right tackle was obviously going to be Mekhi Hart's responsibility, but then Jalen Garth ended up stepping up into that role. And I haven't looked at the snap counts yet. I wonder if he played the full game because somebody with his level of I don't want to call it inexperience because he's been around for so long, but he hasn't played a ton of offensive
Yeah,
snaps in his college career. And so I think Coach Traylor told me this week that he's, basically been kind of feeling it. Like the
yeah,
workload is something that's registering with him, and it's not been easy to come off of so many years of not playing at this level and then being thrust in there in such a prominent role. So we'll see. I don't know exactly who they would go to. It seemed like Buffalo Cruz might have been kind of next up if they need a swing tackle, because Kamar's been able to play every snap, but I think we've seen Buffalo
yeah.
at
DeAndre Marshall, maybe.
yeah, because it was the play where Kamar was injured. I think it was either last week or 2 games ago, and they didn't even run a snap without him because they ended up calling a
Yeah,
timeout. I think Buffalo Cruz came in his place, and yeah, they have a lot of guys who are potential for that role, which means they don't have an obvious one. So
yeah,
I guess there's a lot of different ways they can go with that if they need to, but they're going to be hoping that Jalen Garth can handle the majority of those snaps.
yeah. A couple of more injuries in this game, right? We saw Ken Robinson go down. He left the field for I want to say 2 quarters, came back fully dressed in the fourth quarter. Did not, I don't think he played. Looked like a shoulder issue. We saw Ronald Triplett go down. Danye went down and came back. Like the
Delorean
list,
came back
yeah,
too.
yeah. The list is long, right? And I guess it's not nothing anyone else is dealing with at this time, but for any other team, but for it to be concentrated in so many key areas, right? Like it's kind of been an issue all season, but like that's not why they lost to Texas State, right? Like I'm of the opinion two things can be true. Like they could have battled through and played better, but now at this point, maybe over the last 2 to 3 games, I think it's certainly playing a factor in the outcome of the results, right? And maybe that's why you see some of these pre-snap penalties, some of these holding penalties on those guys that are maybe playing banged up. I don't know. It's a huge list, and it makes you ask the question, why? Why is this happening? I mean, some of it may just be bad luck. Some of it may be program needs, right? Or how the program is built and managed. So I guess we'll see. We'll find out. What's your take on all that?
Yeah, I know Coach Traylor said last week that they have been looking at whether it's the nutrition component of it or the strength and conditioning component of it, or what are they doing or not, or even the, training room component of it. What are they doing or not doing to keep guys up? Because it seems like the offensive line in particular, but in a lot of areas through his tenure, we've often been talking about injuries and the toll that they're taking and how many different. I wonder we should go back for the whole 5 year run of how many different offensive line combinations and how many different games because
That would be wild.
it's a talking point every year. So I don't know if there's something that's going on that's leading to that with that group in particular, or if there's something about UTS's style of play that could be contributing to that. Certainly doesn't seem like the way they practice should be contributing to that because they're pretty adamant about not tackling in practice and sort of limiting the level of physicality there and things that could, Coach Traylor always says nobody goes to the ground in practice because I think that's how they feel a lot of injuries are developed. So it's really interesting that despite some of those safeguards that they would have this many issues. And it's just something that, the other thing is narratively with this, once it starts to become an issue, then we start lumping in other stuff. Like we wouldn't really be talking about Luke Lopez and Johnny Bowens and Nana Nyanwu and that kind of guy who's been out the whole time, if not for all the other injuries that are
Right.
kind of bringing everything back to the forefront. So just the more and more it becomes an issue, the more and more we pull out the microscope on it, and it almost just gets amplified there. But certainly it has been a huge impact, especially because there are so many others that we don't know about, that guys who are just playing
Right.
through and it just never comes up.
Yep. And currently UTSA does not have a nutritionist on staff. They used to have one, and they've had some guys, people leave in their strength and conditioning. So all of that's kind of a work in progress, right? Like we don't really know all the details of what happens behind the scenes, right? With all those different groups.
Yeah, but yes, and I agree 100%, but it is interesting because some of those are relatively new positions.
Right.
So a football team has survived without those things before. And
Right.
so that's still just kind of a standout situation that even compared to years before they had those positions,
Yep.
that this is even worse than that. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's just pretty
Yep.
remarkable the amount of hits they've taken.
Yep. I would say the key word there was survived, right? So here, yeah. Greg, I want to talk about the special teams. Every time there's a punt or field goal, I look down. I always miss what something crazy happens. Was it a block punt or what was it? A block into a block? Like UTSA special team showed up. I mean, it was quiet. It you don't notice them, but pretty good day on special teams for the Roadrunners yesterday.
For sure. I almost think of a blocked punt like a turnover. I mean, you're going to get the possession either way because they're obviously punting it, but the field position aspect of that and how that accelerated some things was critical too. I think it was Cameron Cooper on the block, and then
Yep.
um, I was honestly most impressed special teams wise with Tate Sandell because we've
Right.
been talking all year about the kicking issues, and I don't know what the deal is with Chase Allen. They talked a lot about the operational part of it and just getting the deal down with the snap to the hold, and maybe that was part of it, and maybe that wasn't. But it just felt like the ball wasn't coming off of his foot the same way, and that he didn't have the same level of strength and accuracy and just overall ability that he displayed last year that made him a Grazo Award watch list guy this year. And so to see Tate Sandell be able to come pick that up, presumably when you have a kicker who is a kickoff specialist and is your long field goal guy, the reason he's not doing everything is because of the accuracy.
Accuracy.
But
Yep.
I mean, I haven't watched. It's funny to feel like I need to watch the field goals back, but I don't know if they were right down the middle or if he snuck them in or whatever. But he did go 3 for 3, and that's at the end of the day, that's what you need to do.
Yep. Maybe one Sandell field goal away from winning last week too, right? Who knows? Who knows how that works out? Greg, I think the Roadrunners have had an embattled season so far, right? Like it's not the season everyone's expected, but they come away with a much needed big win against FAU. Now they're got a very winnable game against Tulsa, right? Like what do the Roadrunners need to do to string together two good performances in a row, right? Is it just being consistent, not having five penalties this week after 16 the week before, getting rid of the mistakes and penalties and just trying to limit those turnovers?
Yeah, I feel like, every year when we come into the season and we're talking about what do you think UTSA's record is going to be this year, or what's the correct way to play the over-under win total and things like that, we always end up sort of we obviously look at UTSA and what the Roadrunners have first, but then you look around the league and you say, even if they're not all they're cracked up to be, there's a lot of really winnable games here. And the thing is, the way UTSA played the first half of the season, they were, losing a game like Rice, which is a game that you usually say, even if UTSA is not at the top level that we think they can play at, that they can still win that game just based on, three blowouts the last 3 years. So the reason that those games become a lot more questionable compared to what you expect is when you have those issues like penalties and when things just generally aren't sharp or when it looks like the offense is out of sync and the defense is having breakdowns that lead to big plays. And I just think generally everything looked a lot cleaner in the game against Florida Atlantic. And part of it is the penalties too. 5 for 62 or whatever it was is still not awesome. I mean, especially yardage wise, but two of those were
Suspect. Two of those are suspect. Come
the
on.
kick catch interference. One of them he earned it, and the other one
Yeah.
I guess you could argue either way. But the point being, I think they were when they break it down, they're going to say how many penalties on offense and how many penalties on defense. And if you're getting 2 for 30 on special teams, it's really not that much to distribute
Right.
to those other two.
Yeah.
And then even one of the roughing the passers was, I think like maybe the
Close.
last. It was
Yeah.
like the last 2 minutes where the game was already a two-score margin. It was not the kind of back-breaking play that if you do that earlier in the game or when the game's still in the balance, it's a little bit different. So, and I didn't actually see the play. It could have been, I know Jim Murray's gotten called for some questionable ones there where not that he didn't do it, but that ones where it's just like your hand touches the helmet and so they have to call it's a penalty within the scope of the rules, but I wouldn't consider it a discipline issue, if that makes sense. So, I do think that, if they continue to clean that up and it just on offense, it didn't look like they had some of the confusion or some of the breakdowns we've seen. I don't think they got called for a false start and they got called for
Yeah.
6 against Rice.
Yeah.
So that's a huge step forward. And then defensively, I think of pass interference just as a lost matchup. I don't
Yeah.
think of it any different than giving up a catch, but they
Great.
certainly didn't have any of those that I recall. So
Yep. No holds. Yeah.
yeah, really across the board, it's just a sharper. And if And that's the point that I started this rant with is if they just play clean football, they can beat some of the weaker teams on the schedule. And I think so. They don't have a ton of those left, to be honest,
Right.
but
Yeah.
Tulsa and Temple are the two games that you would think if you just play clean, they can come away with those. And then the other three, they have to play clean just to get into a battle. But looking immediately to next week, I think that they can, if they play like this, they should be able to win that game.
Yep. So are we are we out on bowl eligibility? Are we in? Are we towing the line? What's the expectations for the Roadrunner fans after the last month? Because it's been the internet has been the hot takes have been flying all over the internet over the last few games, and you take a look at where the Roadrunners are, and I mean, the season is not what you expected it to be, but there is still, I mean, they're still in the conversation for bowl eligibility.
Yeah. I mean, understanding that earlier this year I said I just count Rice as a win and then that didn't come together. I will make the same mistake right now and say I think you can count Tulsa and Temple as wins. And
Right.
so
Yep.
you need you if that's true and if that holds form, you need one more out of Memphis at home, North Texas at home, and Army on the road. And of those three games, I would think North Texas at home would be the one that you could most easily find a way to get that done. And so how perfect is that, right? You get the
Right.
rivalry game for
Yeah.
bowl. You're not going to
Yeah.
know it at the time, but it seems like there's a lot riding on that game, and so I think that for a game like that to have that kind of stakes is pretty cool. So we will see if everything holds the form up until then, or maybe UTSA jumps up and gets one against Memphis. I mean, what are they,
Right.
26-3 at home now?
Yep.
So
Yep.
it's hard to bet against them in that environment. And then uh, worst case scenario is your is your 5 wins heading into Army the last
Yep.
week of the season, which
Yep.
seems like a nightmare now. And I know UTSA struggled with them even before they looked like one of the elite teams in the group of five the way they have this year. So basically, the formula is to beat Tulsa and beat Temple and then find another one.
Yep. And I do think if you take a hard look at the teams in the conference, I mean, there's a few teams at the top that are playing really, really well, and it's really everybody else, right? Like, I don't know that there's a big difference from, 3-1 and 1-2.
Yeah, well, it's been a couple years since UTSA wasn't everybody else, so
Yeah,
that's a new
right.
wrinkle that they're kind of trying to find their way through right now.
What else did we miss, Greg, since we last talked? You got any hot takes? Are we still firing the OC? Is the what is the quarterback getting benched? What's
The thing about I try not to do too much offensive coordinator stuff because, and I think a lot of people are guilty of this, but you just are playing the results, right? I mean,
Yeah,
you would have to be watching the game and then in real time saying, I think this would work and this would work and this wouldn't work and this wouldn't work, and then you can see if you were right or wrong. But other
right.
than that, it's just like anytime there's a bad play, you poke holes in it, and anytime there's a good play, you give them a pat on the back, and so. I think it's tough. I mean, I'm not going to say he's done an awesome job or that he's a great offensive coordinator. I don't think he's Will Stein. I don't think that's any secret. But the tools that he has to work with might not be as strong as UTSA has seen the last couple of years between the receivers who have sometimes struggled to get open, in my point of view, and the quarterback who is still kind of learning. And I think it's just been not the easiest assignment for Justin
Yep.
Burke. So I'm not saying, sign him up for the next 10 years or whatever, but maybe we still need to give him a little leeway to, he's relatively new to the role still as well and is kind of feeling it out and feeling out his new personnel. So certainly yesterday, it seemed like there were a lot of things to like about the play calling and
Yep.
you want to poke a hole in the trick play. That's only because it failed. I mean, if it hit, which presumably that's the other part of this
I
is
don't
like,
know if that's going to be successful. I think there were two missed blocks on the play. At best case scenario, it's a negative play or a 0 yardage play there.
if you want, I think sometimes the the crux of the argument to be critical of a coordinator is stuff that we can't know because
Right.
presumably they ran that play successfully in practice at least a handful of times. And
Yeah.
so what we saw is not what they thought they were getting. You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
I don't want to be just like blanket, the coordinators can do no wrong because I don't know enough, but I generally will lean that way more often than not.
Yeah, I tweeted something like the play calling was okay yesterday,
Yeah.
right? And that wasn't in jest. Like, I don't think it's great and I don't think it's terrible. You know what I mean? I mean, and it also goes back to Owen, right? Like, people compare Owen to prime Frank Harris. And last year, Frank Harris wasn't even prime Frank Harris. I think we all forget about the Houston game and, you know, how he looked physically down the stretch of last season because he was hurt, right? So I think, nobody wants to give them time, but I think, Owen's going to learn not to stare down a safety, right? He's going to learn to maybe eat that backwards pass instead of trying to throw it. So we'll see. I think there are certainly ways they could get better, right?
The thing with Frank was always really impressive is we talked about how maybe having when your arm strength is a little bit limited, how difficult
Yep.
it is to make those deep throws outside the numbers. But
Right.
he grew so comfortable with the timing of the offense that
Yep.
he could make a deep throw and hit a guy in stride because he was letting go of it so soon. And
Owen is clearly still working on that.
yeah, there's
Clearly.
plenty of times we've seen him kind of seem to be late to get rid of the
Yeah.
ball or hesitate on his decisions. And if you don't have the arm strength to make up for that, then that becomes a challenge. But you can see where, as a young player, he could potentially develop. That's an easy fix. Like it's something that you're naturally going to see
Yeah.
progress where he becomes more comfortable with that part of it. And the other thing that we didn't talk about is the running game and how
Right.
that could
Yep.
potentially open up some things as that gets going.
Yep.
You
Brandon High and Robert Henry.
yeah, and I don't know really why we haven't been able to see Kavorian Barnes produce at
Yeah.
the level he has in previous years, but I guess that's the strength of having such a deep running back room is you're going to be able to ride the hot hand, and then even after Rocco Griffin transfers out, you have this emerging Brandon High and what he brings to the table, and you have Robert Henry who made some really impressive runs. And you would like to see it be easier, where it's just like everybody gets blocked up and then he gets to run for 7 yards, and it hasn't always been that way. I think this offensive line has at times held up pretty well in pass protection, but it has never looked like a dominant run blocking force. And so the backs are having to do a lot of heavy lifting there. But despite that, it seems like they've been able to get some production going more and more through the year. And especially yesterday, there were times where that hit at a pretty high level. There's other times where they ran under the line for 1 yard, but as long as they can have that threat be on the minds of the defense, it makes things a little easier for Owen too.
Yep. 0-2, a low key rusher. I think he was the leading rusher last game. So, yeah, well, we'll see how that continues to develop.
Yeah, they don't really design that stuff for him, which I
Yep.
understand because he's not a guy that just looking at him that you want him taking a ton of hits, but he is also fearless and he's not averse to taking off and trying to create something with his legs, especially if it's one of these scenarios we've seen where the downfield guys just kind of aren't getting open and he has to make something happen. So it's cool to see that he has that dynamic as well. There's the ability to go through your reads and present a bunch of different threats for the defense because you're not just locked on one target, which he's shown the ability to do at times. But then it's like a whole other extra read that they have to account for when he is willing to take off and has the talent to make the plays with his. And I bet a lot of those guys are not expecting him to be as fast as he is until he actually goes out and does it. It's like he gets a free one every game too.
Yep. He's got some wheels. Well, Greg, I think that did we hit on everything? I know it's been a long time since we got on one of these. I had something after the last game. You had something in the game before, and then we had a bye week squeezed in there. So,
Yeah, I'm trying to remember if there's been some big, we haven't the conference realignment thing is done. I feel like there was some other big maybe peripheral story, but now it's not coming to me, so it can't be that big of a
I
deal.
guess the scuffle after the Rice game, if you want to,
Well, I don't know if we need to relitigate that, but it's
yeah,
certainly not ideal. I see both sides of that. You want to have the level of integrity that you preach
right,
to not engage in something like that and to be the bigger person, even if the other side instigated. But at the same time, you see the guys come over to your sideline and emotions are running high after the
right.
game. I mean, there's no excuse for a cheap shot throwing a punch at a guy who doesn't see you coming, but
And Cyrus did not play. I believe he was suspended for that this game.
that would make sense. We haven't
Yeah,
been told that officially,
yeah,
but that would
right,
make sense given what we saw in video and the fact that he wasn't out there. But I think maybe there's also um, there could have been a level of overreaction in some circles to just the from what I saw in the video. Maybe there was a lot of stuff that happened off camera, and I was too far away to get a good grasp of it. I was still up in the box, but it looked like there was just some kind of pushing and shoving. And obviously, Rice didn't seem to feel the need to punish any of their guys that I
yeah,
heard about. So
right.
they certainly didn't seem to think it was too big of an altercation. So I do think it reflects poorly on the program, and it was interesting that Lisa Campos put out a statement about it, and obviously Jeff commented about it when we asked him about it. And so
Yep,
it seems like they've kind of handled that, but certainly, it seemed like everybody was on their best behavior yesterday. I don't
yep,
know.
yep, yep.
So
That Rice press box is the highest press box of all time, by the way, too. So very difficult to see. Yeah, I think that'll wrap it up, Greg. Unless you got anything else.
No, I think we're good. I'm glad we got to do this again. The people are always asking me.
Yep.
I was coming into the Alamo Dome yesterday, and the guy who was checking the bags at the door said, "When are you going to do the video with JJ again?" And I said, "I hopefully tomorrow." So
Yep.
you're watching
Yep.
again. Appreciate your
Well, here we
help.
go. It feels great to be back. We're both going to Tulsa next week, right? So we'll
Yeah,
we'll
brother.
we'll we'll wrap up that one. Hopefully, it'll be an interesting week this week to see how UTSA battles through some of these injuries, right? And we get updates on who's available and who's not, and how the team continues to try and trend upward. So I think that'll wrap it up, Greg. I'm JJ Perez, Inside Runner Sports. That's Greg Luca with the San Antonio Express News. Thanks for watching, everyone.